morning, everybody. Today we're going to see the short story. First of all, what do we understand by a short story? A short story is a brief fictional prose narrative which often involves one connected episode, whereas a novel will have many more episodes, and that's why it would be divided into chapters. Edgar Allan Poe, in his famous essay, The Philosophy of Composition, that we are going to see later, he says that a short story should be read at one sitting. That means that it should not take longer than 2 hours, from half an hour to 2 hours, because he believes that the effect is lost in a long text. He also states in that famous essay that every plot must be elaborated to its denouement. That is to say, incidents and tone tend to the development of the intention. All short stories should have a unique and single effect, and every plot must be written having that single effect in mind. So, the act of composition by Edgar Allan Poe is by no means accident or intuition, because every element of the plot has to be planned in such a way that will contribute to create that unique a single effect. For example, if I want to write a short story whose single effect is that of horror, then before sitting down to write the story, I should think about the plot and the different elements. So which is a setting that is appropriate to create that single effect of horror. Once I have decided upon the setting, then I will have to think about the characters. Which characters will contribute? What sort of characters will contribute to create that single effect of horror? Then I will have to think about the incidents or the events that will take place, and so on. So once I have already thought of all the elements of plot that will contribute to create that unique and single effect, then I can sit down and write. That's why the act of composition is no accident or intuition, but is a result of careful planning. Now, which are the different elements? When we talk about a short story, we talk about plot. And plot is a sequence of related events that compose the narrative, or in other words, is a change of events. Very often one event is a result of the previous one. But it's the narrative, what happens. And you have to be careful and distinguish between plot and theme, because plot is this change of events, while theme is a general abstract idea that can be expressed probably in 1 to 2 words, whereas a plot you have to tell what happens in the story. When we think of plot, we should also think of the different elements that constitute plot, and then you have a sort of drawing that explains them. The first thing is the exposition. That belongs to the first part of the short story, in which most of the time characters and setting are introduced. Immediately afterwards, you have the narrative hook. Like the name says, it is a hook that calls the reader's attention to keep on reading the story. After that, you will have different rising actions. I have just marked 2, but you might have 1 or you might have 5. And those are the actions that will build up tension in the story until you reach the climax, which is the highest point of tension in the story. Immediately after the climax, you have the falling action that will lead to the resolution and to the end of the story. In some short stories, we also speak of foreshadowing. Foreshadowing means those elements that give you clues of what might happen in the development of the story. The title might act as foreshadowing. For example, there is a short story by Edgar Allan Poe that is called The Cask of Amontillado. That is the title of the short story. And cask has a double meaning. It can be the container of wine, but it can also be a coffin. So in that way, the title is foreshadowing what will happen to this man in Amontillado, that he will be killed, he will be murdered in the catacombs while tasting a cask of wine, right? So there are different elements that will act as foreshadowing. We saw that, for example, in the wedding knells, that the nailing of bells foreshadows that the Mrs. Dabney is about to die by the end. All right. When you analyze short stories, you should also think about characters. And there are different types of characters. You have the protagonist, and then you might have the antagonist. The protagonist is the main character. Then, depending on the way they developed, they can be considered flat characters or round characters, or static versus dynamic characters. Flat characters are those characters from which you do not know much. Either you just get a glimpse of what they look physically, but there is no a psychological description of what these characters think. So they are flat. That would be a synonym of superficial characterization. Round characters are those characters that are described physically and psychologically, so you have a complete view of what the character is like. On the other hand, you can also classify characters into static and dynamic. Static characters are those that do not develop or do not change throughout the story. They remain the same type of people from the very beginning till the very end. Whereas the dynamic characters are those that develop, they grow, they become wiser, more mature, or on the other hand, they might become worse people, but there is a change in those characters. Now, you should also think in terms of characterization, that is to say, how these characters are presented. They might be fully described. Indirect characterization is when there are statements about characters. That is to say, characters are described by the narrator, or it can be indirect characterization, that is to say, when we get to know what the character is like through the dialogues those characters established among themselves, or because of what they think, because of the words they use. So it's not that we are told he was intelligent and very wise, but because of the dialogues he establishes with other characters, we can reach to the same conclusion. The first one would be direct characterization, whereas the second, when we get to know about the characters through dialogue, thoughts, and words, then we will be talking about indirect characterization. Every story is set in a place and a time. So when we think in terms of setting, we have to think in terms of where the story takes place and when the story takes place. Sometimes the place is very important for the story to develop, and we might wonder whether it is significant or not. We say that a setting and place or time are significant when that story could not have taken place somewhere else or at a different time. Otherwise, we might say that place and time in this short story is not that relevant, because the same could have taken place at any moment or at any century. Very often, the place and time also creates a certain atmosphere. They contribute to the creation of atmosphere. In some short stories, this change of setting signals an important development in the story. So, setting might be important or might not be that important. Sometimes in a short story, it's much more important the conflict, because it's an internal conflict, than the setting. Whereas when it is an external conflict, then setting might play a fundamental role. We'll see that when we analyze the different short stories. When you analyze a short story, you should also think about the conflict the characters experience. That conflict can be external or can be internal. External is when the character experiences a conflict either against nature, against another human being, or against society in general. For example, an external conflict could be the one the main character of the story has against an antagonist, right? Or it might be against society. If you have ever happened to, if you have heard about the adventures of Huckleberry Finn has a conflict against society because he finds it difficult to adjust to the rules of society, right? Or the conflict can be internal, which is within the character's mind, is when the character has to make a moral choice, right? So it's not that he has an antagonist, another character that is the enemy, or it's not, but it is within himself. For example, Hamlet has an internal conflict. He has to decide whether to punish the murderer of his father or not. That is an internal conflict. External could be, for example, the one that Huckleberry Finn has when he does not find it easy to adjust and to conform to the rules of society. He doesn't want to go to school, and this is what society expects from him, right? Another important aspect to consider when analyzing a short story is the point of view. So who is the narrator? Who tells the story? You can have a first-person narrator or a third-person narrator. A first-person narrator is that narrator that is a character himself in the story. So he's telling the story from within the story. So that might lead us to the question of, is he a reliable narrator? Can we trust what he says, or is he unreliable? Very often when you read Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, we are going to read The Black Cat next week probably, and you realize that the first-person narrator is a madman, then it is very difficult to believe him because you see that from the very beginning that he's obsessed. So he's an unreliable narrator that you cannot trust. Or you might have a third-person narrator, which is the sort of narrator that is a witness, that tells what he could see at some time in the story. And that witness might be a limited omniscient because he can see and he tells the story only through the eyes of one particular character, or it can be an omniscient, all-knowing narrator who stands outside the story and knows everything that goes in the mind of the different characters. So omniscient means that he's like a god, that he can know whatever the characters think. If it is limited, he will know only what one character thinks, and he will tell the story from the point of view of that character. If he's an omniscient narrator, he stands outside the story and he can get into the mind of all the characters. We are going to exemplify that with the different short stories that we are going to study. And finally, there are two concepts that very often appear in short stories. One is the use of irony and the other is the use of symbols. When we talk about irony, I think I explained that, or you must have studied that in the theater's speech at the beginning of the year. You might talk about verbal irony or situational irony. Verbal irony has to do with saying one thing and just meaning the opposite. And situational irony is what happens. Very often the character is not aware of that, although you as readers know what happens. And symbols, very often writers choose objects or seasons or anything that stands for something else in the story. So for example, the cask of Amontillado, this cask is a symbol because it has to do with death. It has to do with a coffin, in the same way that the shroud in the wedding nails is a symbol of death. Okay. These are the different elements we are going to analyze when we study the different short stories in this unit.